every night, the dream began the same way. Emily stood alone on the roof of a massive building somewhere in the middle of a dark American city. She never knew which city it was supposed to be. It had no name, no landmarks she could recognize, no familiar skyline that helped her place it. It could have been Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, or some impossible version of all of them pressed together into one endless grid of black glass, concrete towers, empty streets, and distant windows glowing faintly beneath a dead sky. But every time she arrived there, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was alone, not just alone on the roof, alone in the city. There were no cars moving below. No headlights sliding between the buildings, no sirens, no horns, no voices drifting up from sidewalks or alleyways. The streets far beneath her were completely empty, stretching in long, straight lines through the darkness, like veins with no blood left inside them. Even the windows in the surrounding buildings looked wrong. Some were lit, but none of them showed movement. No silhouettes passing behind curtains. No flicker of televisions. No sign that anyone lived behind the glass. The city existed, but nothing in it lived. The only sound was the wind. It moved constantly across the rooftop, low and steady, pushing at Emily's clothes and cutting through her hair. It whistled around ventilation units, rattled loose metal panels, and dragged itself through the railings with a sound that almost resembled breathing when she listened too closely. The wind was always cold in the dream. Not normal nighttime cold, but the kind of cold that seemed to come from inside the building itself, rising up through the concrete beneath her feet. At first, Emily always stood near the center of the roof. That was how the dream started. She would open her eyes, already aware that she was dreaming, already aware that this had happened before, and find herself standing several yards away from the edge. Behind her were old rooftop machines, boxy metal structures, vents, pipes, and a locked access door that never opened no matter how many times she tried it. In front of her was the ledge, and beyond that ledge was the city. She always knew she should stay away from it. That knowledge came immediately, before fear even had time to fully form. It wasn't a thought so much as a rule written into the dream itself. Stay away from the edge. Do not look down. Do not move closer. If she could just remain in the center of the rooftop until the dream ended, maybe nothing would happen. Maybe she would wake up before it reached the part she dreaded. But the dream never allowed that. Something always began pulling her forward. It was never a hand on her back, never a visible force. Nothing grabbed her at first. There was no voice whispering in her ear, no shadow pushing her along. It was much worse because it came from inside her. A pressure formed behind her thoughts, slow and patient, urging her to take one step. Just one. Emily always resisted at first. She would clench her fists, plant her feet against the rooftop, and try to focus on anything except the edge. The locked door behind her, the rusted bolts on the ventilation unit nearby, the gravel scattered across the concrete. She would tell herself not to move. She would remind herself that she knew how this ended. But then her foot would slide forward, only a little, then another step. The first few movements were always small enough that she could almost pretend they didn't count. A shift of weight, a stumble, a half step made while trying to catch her balance. But once she moved, the pressure became stronger. The roof seemed to tilt subtly beneath her, though visually it remained flat. The wind pushed from behind. The darkness below seemed to expand, waiting. With every step, her panic grew. Emily would start breathing faster. Her chest would tighten. Her hands would tremble. She would turn her head away, refusing to look at the ledge, but it didn't matter. Her body knew where it was going. It carried her forward with terrible calm, step by step, while her mind screamed at her to stop. The strangest part was that she never ran. If she had run, maybe it would have felt less horrifying. Running would have meant panic, loss of control, something violent and obvious. But in the dream, she walked, slowly, almost carefully, like a person approaching something sacred. Like the part of her that moved had accepted what was coming long before the rest of her did. The edge drew closer. The wind grew louder. The empty city spread wider beneath the sky. By the time Emily reached the final few feet of the rooftop, her entire body was shaking. She could feel the drop before she saw it. Some deep animal part of her knew there was nothing beyond that line of concrete except open air and distance. The ledge itself was low, barely reaching her knees, a narrow raised border around the roof that would not stop anyone from falling if they lost balance. She always tried to stop there. Always. Her heels pressed against the rooftop, her shoulders tensed. She leaned backward as much as she could, fighting the invisible pull with everything she had. For one brief second, she sometimes believed she might actually win. The wind would pause, the city would remain still, and the edge would sit just beyond her reach. Then she would look down. She never chose to. Her head simply turned, her eyes lowered, and the street appeared far below her, impossibly distant, darker than it should have been. The building seemed too tall, much taller than it had looked from the roof. The streets were not merely hundreds of feet below. They felt miles away, buried under layers of black air. The sidewalks and roadways at the bottom looked flat and unreal, like a model city built at the bottom of a well. There was never anything down there at first. No people, no movement, only darkness between the buildings. Then came the sound, not from behind her, from below. A faint scraping noise against concrete. Emily would freeze every time she heard it. Her breath would catch in her throat. Her fingers would curl instinctively as she tried to back away. But by then, it was always too late. The scraping became louder, closer. Something was climbing. The first hand always appeared on the left side of the ledge. Pale fingers rose over the concrete slowly, curling around the edge with awful precision. The skin was colorless, almost gray under the dim city light, stretched tight across long knuckles. The nails were cracked and dark at the tips, as if they had been dragged across stone for a long time. Then another hand appeared. Then another, and another. Within seconds, several pale hands gripped the edge of the roof from below, fingers tightening against the concrete as if whatever they belonged to was pulling itself upward from the side of the building. Emily screamed before they touched her. She always screamed. But the city swallowed the sound completely. No echo came back. No window opened. No one below looked up. The dream city remained empty and indifferent, while the hands reached higher. Emily stumbled backward, or tried to, but the hands moved faster than they should have. One shot forward and clamped around her ankle. Another gripped the fabric of her pants just below the knee. Then a third wrapped cold fingers around her other leg. The touch was always the worst part. The hands felt real, freezing cold, damp, too strong. Emily kicked violently, trying to tear herself free, but the grip only tightened. Pain flared where the fingers dug into her skin. Her balance broke immediately. She fell forward against the ledge, catching herself with both hands for one desperate second as her body tipped over the edge. For that 1 second, she saw them. Not clearly. Never clearly. Shapes clinging to the side of the building beneath her, pale arms reaching upward from darkness, faces hidden below the ledge where her eyes could not quite find them. There were more than there should have been. More hands, more bodies, as if the side of the building was covered with them, waiting just beneath the roof line. Then they pulled. Emily's stomach lurched as her feet left the rooftop. Her hands scraped across the concrete edge, nails tearing painfully as she tried to hold on. The wind roared around her. The city tilted. For a fraction of a second, she was suspended halfway over the ledge, caught between the rooftop and the abyss. Then her grip failed, and she fell. The falling never felt like a dream. That was why it had destroyed her sleep for months. It did not have the strange, floaty quality nightmares sometimes had. It did not skip or blur. Every second was sharp, physical. Her body dropped through the cold air with sickening speed, the building rushing past beside her in dark, vertical lines. Wind tore at her face and forced her mouth open around a scream she could barely hear. The streets below rose toward her. Too fast, too silent. Emily's mind always broke during the fall. There was no time for thoughts, only pure terror. She flailed helplessly, reaching for anything, but there was nothing to grab. Windows flashed past, black glass, empty rooms. Reflections that sometimes looked like figures standing inside the building, watching her fall. Sometimes, in the final seconds, she thought she heard breathing beside her, as if something had fallen with her, as if the hands had not let go. The ground came closer. The darkness opened beneath her, and just before impact, Emily woke up screaming. She shot upright in bed with her throat raw, her hands clawing at the sheets, her heart pounding so violently that for several seconds she could not tell whether she was awake or still falling. Her bedroom was dark except for the faint glow of the alarm clock on the nightstand. The curtains were still. The floor was solid. The ceiling was where it belonged. But her legs hurt. They always hurt. Emily sat there shaking, drenched in sweat, gasping for air while the dream dissolved around the edges of her memory, but refused to disappear completely. She reached down with trembling hands and touched her ankles, half expecting to feel fingers still wrapped around them. There was nothing there. No hands, no rooftop, no city, only the faint red numbers on her clock. 3:17 a.m. again. Emily stared at the time until her breathing slowed enough to become painful instead of frantic. She knew she would not sleep again that night. She never did after the dream, because closing her eyes meant returning to the roof. And no matter how many times she woke up before hitting the ground, the fear stayed with her like something physical, like a warning or a memory. The dream stopped feeling like a nightmare after the first few weeks. Nightmares ended when people woke up. This thing followed Emily into the rest of her life. At first, she tried handling it the way most people handled bad dreams. She ignored it. She told herself it would disappear eventually if she stopped thinking about it. Everyone had recurring nightmares sometimes. Stress did strange things to the brain. Lack of sleep intensified anxiety. There had to be a rational explanation for it. That was what she repeated to herself during the first month. By the second month, she stopped believing it. The problem was not simply that the dream returned every night. The problem was how consistent it remained. Normal dreams shifted over time. Details changed, faces blurred together, locations became distorted or random. But Emily's nightmare repeated itself with impossible precision. The rooftop never changed. The empty city never changed. The wind always sounded the same. Even the exact moment the hands appeared remained identical every single night. Sometimes she tried forcing herself to stay awake. That only made things worse. At first, exhaustion delayed the dream. She would lie in bed staring at the ceiling until sunrise, surviving on caffeine and anxiety while telling herself she was gaining control. But eventually, her body always won. She would fall asleep unintentionally for minutes at a time. On the couch, at her desk, once even standing inside the subway during her commute home. And every time she slept, even briefly, she returned to the rooftop. The worst incident happened in late October. Emily worked in digital marketing for a small advertising company in downtown Chicago, a job she had once tolerated but now barely survived. By then, her co-workers had already started noticing something wrong with her. She arrived late constantly. She forgot conversations halfway through them. She stared into space during meetings without hearing anything around her. Some mornings, she looked so exhausted people asked if she was sick. One afternoon, she fell asleep in the office bathroom for less than 5 minutes. That was all it took. The dream returned immediately. The rooftop, the wind, the edge pulling her closer. This time, when the hands grabbed her legs, she woke so violently that she slammed backward into one of the bathroom stalls hard enough to bruise her shoulder. A co-worker outside heard the crash and asked if she was okay. Emily lied and said she had slipped. After that, panic attacks started. At first, they came unexpectedly. Riding elevators, standing near windows, walking across parking garages. Anywhere high enough for her mind to associate with the rooftop triggered sudden waves of terror that left her shaking and breathless. Her chest tightened until she genuinely believed she was dying. Sometimes her vision blurred so badly she had to sit down wherever she was standing. The attacks grew worse at night. Emily developed a routine without realizing it. Every evening, she checked the locks on her apartment door multiple times. She avoided mirrors because exhausted reflections sometimes startled her. She stopped watching television before bed because silence felt safer than noise. Then, even silence became unbearable because it reminded her of the dream city. Sleep itself became something terrifying. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, she usually gave up trying entirely. She would sit in the kitchen wrapped in a blanket drinking coffee while staring out the apartment window at the city below. The streets outside still had life, traffic lights changing, distant sirens, late-night pedestrians moving between bars and restaurants. Real people, real movement. She needed those sounds. Without them, the world started feeling too much like the rooftop. Her apartment slowly changed with her exhaustion. Dishes piled in the sink because she stopped caring enough to wash them. Laundry gathered across the floor. Half-finished cups of coffee appeared in every room. The curtains remained permanently closed after sunset because seeing the Chicago skyline at night made her stomach tighten. By the 3rd month, reality itself began feeling unstable. Not dramatically at first. Small things. She started hearing sounds that disappeared when she turned toward them. Scraping noises in her apartment that always turned out to be nothing. Once she became convinced someone was standing outside her bedroom door at night, breathing softly in the darkness. She spent nearly 20 minutes staring at the hallway before finally forcing herself to check. Nothing was there. Another time she nearly screamed after catching sight of pale fingers reflected briefly in the subway window beside her. Again, nothing. The sleep deprivation hollowed her out slowly. Dark circles formed permanently beneath her eyes. Her hands shook constantly from caffeine and exhaustion. She lost weight because anxiety made eating feel difficult. Conversations became harder to follow. Some mornings, she genuinely struggled to remember what day it was. And still the dream continued. Every night, always the same. The rooftop began appearing even while she was awake sometimes. Not physically, but in flashes. Standing at crosswalks, she would suddenly imagine the streets below looking impossibly distant. Wind between tall buildings started making her chest tighten instantly. She avoided rooftops completely, avoided balconies, avoided windows in high-rise buildings, which became difficult in Chicago. Eventually, her manager pulled her aside after work and asked if she needed medical leave. Emily lied again. She said she was dealing with stress. The truth sounded insane even inside her own head. How was she supposed to explain that she was terrified of falling asleep because something in her dreams kept trying to drag her off a building? The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in November. Emily had managed almost 30 hours without sleep by then. Her thoughts felt slow and disconnected, like her brain was struggling to keep pace with reality. She stopped at a grocery store on the walk home from work and nearly collapsed in the checkout line after hearing wind whistling through the automatic doors. For one horrible second, the store disappeared. She saw the rooftop again, the empty city, the edge. Then someone touched her shoulder asking if she was okay, and reality snapped back hard enough to leave her dizzy. That night, she searched online for sleep disorder specialists. Most results felt useless. Generic anxiety clinics, meditation programs, articles explaining recurring dreams caused by stress or unresolved trauma. None of it felt connected to what was happening to her anymore. Then she found Dr. Daniel Mercer. His office specialized in panic disorders, recurring nightmares, and exposure therapy. Several reviews mentioned patients with severe phobias improving dramatically under his treatment. Heights, enclosed spaces, trauma-related anxiety. Emily scheduled an appointment at nearly 4 a.m. before she could talk herself out of it. 3 days later, she sat across from him in a quiet office 30 floors above downtown Chicago. The height alone nearly made her leave immediately. Dr. Mercer looked younger than she expected. Mid-40s, maybe. Calm voice, expensive gray suit. The kind of carefully controlled demeanor therapists practiced professionally. His office walls were lined with bookshelves and framed certificates, while soft instrumental music played quietly somewhere near the back of the room. Emily hated how calm the place felt. It made her own anxiety seem irrational immediately. "So," Mercer said gently after introducing himself, "tell me about the dream." At first, Emily struggled explaining it aloud. Saying the details made them sound ridiculous somehow. A repeating nightmare about a rooftop and pale hands dragging her into darkness. The more she described it, the more childish it sounded compared to the absolute terror it created every night. But Mercer listened carefully, without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back slightly in his chair. "And you've had this exact dream every night?" "Yes." "For months?" Emily nodded. Mercer folded his hands thoughtfully. "Recurring dreams tied to anxiety are more common than people realize," he explained calmly. "Especially dreams involving falling, helplessness, or loss of control." Emily stared at him. "You think that's all this is?" "I think your brain has attached emotional significance to the dream." Mercer's tone remained steady and clinical. Once fear establishes a pattern, avoidance strengthens it. Emily frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means every time you avoid sleep, avoid heights, avoid situations reminding you of the dream, your mind interprets the fear as valid. Mercer leaned forward slightly. Anxiety grows through reinforcement. Part of Emily wanted to feel relieved hearing that. His explanation sounded rational, clean, psychological, something treatable. But another part of her felt strangely disappointed too. Because deep down, the dream did not feel symbolic. It felt real. Mercer continued asking questions for nearly an hour afterward. Childhood trauma, stress levels, relationships, work pressure, sleep habits. Emily answered automatically, while exhaustion dragged heavily at her thoughts. Finally, Mercer set his notebook aside. You're trapped in a cycle, he said. You fear the dream, so you avoid situations connected to it. That avoidance makes the fear stronger. Then the dream becomes more emotionally powerful. Emily rubbed tiredly at her eyes. So, what am I supposed to do? Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You confront it. The words immediately tightened something inside her chest. What? Controlled exposure therapy. Mercer spoke calmly, almost casually. Your mind has transformed heights into a psychological trigger. To break that association, you need to experience the situation safely. Emily shook her head instantly. No. You're already allowing the fear to control your life. You don't understand how real it feels. I understand that your brain believes the fear is real. Mercer's expression remained patient, which is exactly why avoidance strengthens it. Emily looked away toward the office windows overlooking the city below. 30 floors up. The sight immediately made her stomach tighten. Mercer noticed. Look at the skyline, he said gently. Emily hesitated before forcing herself toward the glass. Chicago stretched endlessly beyond the building beneath the gray evening sky. Cars moved through the streets far below. Tiny people crossed intersections. Everything looked normal, safe. You're uncomfortable, Mercer said. But nothing bad is happening. Emily swallowed hard. That's different. Why? Because the dream isn't here. Mercer became quiet briefly. Then, your subconscious disagrees. The session ended shortly afterward, but his final words stayed with her long after leaving the office. You cannot spend the rest of your life running from a dream, Emily. She didn't answer him then, because part of her feared he might be right, and another part feared he wasn't. Emily spent the next 3 days trying to convince herself she would never follow Dr. Mercer's advice. Every rational part of her rejected the idea immediately. The thought of voluntarily standing on a rooftop at night felt insane after everything the dream had done to her. Even imagining it made her stomach tighten. Yet despite that fear, Mercer's words stayed trapped in the back of her mind long after the session ended. Avoidance strengthens fear. The sentence repeated itself constantly afterward, while riding elevators, while crossing bridges, while staring at the dark outline of downtown buildings outside her apartment window at night. Part of Emily hated him for how simple he made it sound. As if months of terror, sleepless nights, and panic attacks could be solved by standing near the thing, frightening her until her brain decided to stop reacting. But another part of her, a quieter part she tried ignoring, wondered whether he was right, because nothing else had worked. The dreams continued every night. The rooftop, the wind, the hands, the falling. Every morning she woke feeling worse than the day before. Her body ached constantly from exhaustion now. Her nerves felt permanently exposed, like every sound around her scraped directly against her thoughts. She could barely focus at work anymore. Twice she caught herself staring blankly at computer screens for several minutes without remembering what task she had been doing. And the fear kept spreading. At first, she had only feared sleeping. Now she feared height itself. Even reflections of tall buildings unsettled her. Looking upward between skyscrapers made her dizzy. Walking near rooftops or open parking structures triggered instant nausea. The nightmare was infecting reality piece by piece. By Friday evening, Emily realized she could not keep living like that much longer. The idea came slowly, not suddenly, not dramatically. She simply found herself thinking about Mercer's office building again during her train ride home. 30 floors high, quiet, professional, safe. The rooftop would likely be empty after business hours. Controlled exposure therapy. That was what Mercer called it. The phrase sounded clinical enough to almost remove the fear from it. Almost. Emily spent most of Saturday trying not to think about the idea. She cleaned her apartment for the first time in weeks just to keep herself distracted. She forced herself to eat real food instead of coffee and energy bars. She watched television without absorbing any of it. Every few hours, she glanced toward the skyline outside her windows and immediately looked away again. By evening, the anxiety had become unbearable. Because now the rooftop existed in two places, inside the dream and waiting somewhere in the real world. At around 11:30 that night, Emily finally left her apartment. Chicago had already begun emptying into the strange quiet that large cities sometimes reached after midnight. The streets still held movement, distant traffic, scattered pedestrians, flashing signs reflected across wet pavement. But everything felt slower, dimmer. The city looked tired. Cold wind moved between the buildings as she walked. That immediately made her chest tighten. For several seconds, she considered turning around and going home. She could already feel her heartbeat accelerating beneath her coat. Her hands had started trembling again. But she kept walking. Mercer's office building stood near the river downtown, a sleek, modern tower of steel and reflective glass rising above the surrounding streets. During the day, it looked expensive and ordinary. At night, it looked completely different. The upper floors disappeared into darkness against the cloudy sky, while only scattered office windows remained illuminated. The building seemed far taller now than it had during her appointment. Too tall. Emily stopped across the street, staring upward. Her stomach twisted instantly. For one horrible second, she imagined the dream rooftop waiting somewhere above the clouds. The empty city, the edge, the hands. She almost left then. Actually turned halfway around before stopping herself. This is exactly what he meant. The realization frustrated her immediately. Mercer had been right about one thing at least. Her entire life now revolved around avoiding fear, avoiding sleep, avoiding buildings, avoiding anything remotely connected to the nightmare. The dream controlled her because she allowed it to control her. That thought finally pushed her forward. The lobby was nearly empty when she entered the building. A single security guard sat behind the front desk, watching muted television while barely acknowledging her presence. Emily kept expecting someone to stop her, to ask why she was there so late. But nobody did. The elevator ride upward felt worse than she expected. As the numbers climbed higher, pressure slowly tightened around her ribs. The mirrored elevator walls reflected her pale, exhausted face from every angle. She looked sick, hollow-eyed, nervous enough to bolt at any second. 30 floors, exactly the same height as Mercer's office. The elevator stopped with a soft mechanical chime. Emily stepped out into the silent hallway outside the therapy offices. Most of the lights had already dimmed for the night, leaving the corridor washed in soft amber illumination. Everything felt still, professional, empty, safe. She exhaled slowly. Nothing bad had happened. No panic attack, no rooftop, no hands. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a faint flicker of control returning. Then she saw the sign for rooftop access. Her chest tightened immediately again. The metal door stood near the far end of the hallway beside a maintenance stairwell. A small, illuminated exit sign glowed above it. Beyond that door waited open air and height and everything she had spent months fearing. Emily stared at it for nearly a full minute. Then she walked toward it. Each step felt unreal somehow. Detached, like she was watching another person move through the hallway instead of herself. By the time she reached the door, her breathing had become shallow again. She grabbed the handle, cold metal against her palm. For a second, she expected resistance. Locked access, alarms, something preventing her from continuing. Instead, the door opened immediately. Wind rushed inside from the stairwell beyond. Emily froze. The sound alone nearly sent her backward. It was too similar to the wind from the dream, low and constant, moving through concrete and steel with the same hollow tone. Her body reacted instantly. Muscles tightening, heart pounding, adrenaline flooding through her chest. But she forced herself upward anyway. The stairwell climbed only one additional level before ending at another heavy metal door leading outside. Emily stopped at the top step, staring at it, while the wind vibrated softly through the frame. This was the point of no return. If she opened that door, there would be no pretending anymore, no distancing herself from the nightmare. She would stand inside the closest thing reality could offer to the dream itself. Her hand shook as she reached for the handle. Then slowly, she pushed the door open. Cold air flooded over her immediately. The rooftop stretched outward beneath the cloudy night sky, surrounded by steel railings, ventilation systems, and blinking aircraft warning lights mounted near the corners of the building. Beyond the ledges, Chicago spread endlessly in every direction, glowing with white and red lights beneath drifting clouds. Emily stepped outside carefully. The wind moved around her coat. The city waited below. And for several terrible seconds, nothing happened. Her breathing remained fast initially. Her legs felt weak. Every instinct still screamed at her to stay away from the edges of the roof. But the overwhelming panic she expected never fully arrived. There were no pale hands, no unnatural silence, no impossible emptiness. The city below was alive. Traffic moved through intersections. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Lights spilled from apartment windows across neighboring towers. Unlike the dream, this world contained people, motion, sound, reality. Emily slowly walked farther onto the rooftop. The fear remained, but something else appeared beneath it too. Relief. A strange, disorienting relief. For months, she had built the rooftop into something monstrous inside her mind. The nightmare had transformed height itself into a place of pure terror. Yet standing there now, she realized the real world did not feel the same. The dream rooftop had always felt dead. This place felt calm. Wind moved gently across the building. The skyline stretched beautifully against the clouds. Far below, headlights drifted through the streets like flowing rivers of light. The city suddenly looked peaceful instead of threatening. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Nothing grabbed her. No hands reached upward. No invisible force dragged her toward the edge. For the first time in months, her chest loosened slightly. Mercer was right. The realization hit her slowly but powerfully enough to make her laugh softly under her breath. God. He was actually right. The dream had infected her thinking so completely that she had forgotten what reality felt like. She had turned ordinary fear into something sacred, untouchable. The nightmare only controlled her because she kept feeding it. Standing there now, she felt foolish, exhausted, but foolish too. Emily walked farther across the rooftop while breathing slowly, forcing herself to look outward instead of downward. The city lights no longer made her dizzy. The wind no longer sounded threatening. She was okay. Actually okay. The thought almost made her emotional. For weeks, she had lived like someone being hunted by her own mind. She stopped sleeping, stopped functioning, stopped trusting reality itself. And now, after all that terror, she stood calmly on the roof of a 30-story building, realizing there had never been anything here to fear. The nightmare was only a nightmare, nothing more. Emily smiled weakly to herself. Then she started moving closer to the edge. At first, Emily only approached the edge to prove she could. That was what she told herself anyway. The fear had already begun fading by the time she crossed the center of the rooftop. Her breathing steadied. The tightness in her chest loosened. Even the wind felt different now, colder than before perhaps, but natural. Real. Nothing like the dead, empty silence from the dream. The city below stretched endlessly beneath the clouds, alive with motion and distant light. Traffic signals changed at intersections far below. Tiny headlights slid through the streets in slow lines of red and white. Somewhere nearby, a siren echoed briefly before disappearing again beneath the noise of the wind. Reality, that was the important thing. Reality sounded alive. Emily kept repeating that silently while walking closer to the ledge. Each step felt easier than the last. The panic she expected never arrived. No invisible force dragged her forward. No unnatural silence swallowed the city. The rooftop remained exactly what it truly was. A normal rooftop on top of a normal office building in downtown Chicago. Dr. Mercer had been right. The realization filled her with a strange mixture of relief and embarrassment. She had spent months destroying herself over something that now seemed absurd in hindsight. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, and fear had turned one recurring nightmare into a psychological prison. And she had let it happen. Emily actually laughed softly to herself as she neared the edge. The sound surprised her. It felt strange hearing herself laugh again after so many weeks of panic. She stopped only a few feet away from the ledge now. Wind moved through her hair while the skyline stretched around her in every direction. The height still made her nervous, but it no longer felt overwhelming. She could feel her body slowly adjusting, her brain finally recognizing that she wasn't in danger. Nothing was waiting for her below. No hands, no shadows, no nightmare. For several seconds, Emily simply stood there breathing in the cold night air. Then she took another step forward. Now the edge was directly in front of her. A low concrete barrier ran around the perimeter of the rooftop, barely reaching above her knees. Beyond it was open air, and 30 floors of empty space dropping toward the streets below. Her stomach tightened slightly at the sight. But only slightly. Emily rested one hand carefully against the concrete ledge and looked out over the city. Chicago glittered beneath the cloudy sky like an ocean of distant light. The view should have terrified her after everything the dream had done to her. Instead, it looked beautiful. For the first time in months, she felt genuinely calm. The realization almost overwhelmed her more than the fear had. She had forgotten what calm felt like. No racing heartbeat, no panic attack, no feeling of something terrible waiting just beyond her thoughts. Only cold wind and city lights. Emily smiled again, this time more naturally. Jesus, she muttered quietly to herself. I really let a dream ruin my life. The words disappeared into the wind. For several moments, nothing happened afterward. Then, she heard breathing. The sound came from somewhere directly beneath her. Emily froze instantly. At first, she thought it might be the wind moving strangely around the side of the building. But then she heard it again. A sharp, uneven gasp. Human. Close. Her entire body stiffened. Slowly, Emily looked downward over the ledge. Nothing was there initially. Only darkness stretching along the side of the building toward the streets far below. Then came another sound. Scraping. Rough and frantic. Concrete grinding against something hard. Emily's stomach tightened violently. The sound was getting closer. For one horrible second, her mind refused to process what she was hearing because it matched the dream too perfectly. The scratching noise against the side of the building, the breathing beneath the edge, the exact position she stood in now. No. Her pulse suddenly accelerated hard enough to hurt. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. The scraping became louder, closer. Something was climbing. Emily stumbled backward instinctively, but before she could fully move away, a hand shot upward over the edge of the roof. It grabbed her ankle instantly. Emily screamed. The sound tore out of her throat before she even understood what she was seeing. The grip around her leg felt horrifyingly real. Cold fingers clamping tightly through the fabric of her jeans. Exactly like the dream. For one impossible second, panic completely paralyzed her. Then another hand appeared beside the first, gripping the concrete ledge hard enough that pieces of stone cracked loose beneath blood-covered fingernails. A man pulled himself partially into view from below the building. He looked terrified, not threatening. Terrified. His face was pale beneath the rooftop lights, soaked in sweat and twisted with desperation. Blood covered several of his fingers where the concrete had torn the skin away. His arms shook violently from the effort of holding himself above the drop. "Help me," he gasped. Emily stared at him in absolute shock. The man looked to be in his 30s, dressed in dark clothes smeared with dirt and blood. One side of his face was bruised badly. His eyes locked onto hers with pure panic as he clung desperately to the edge of the building. "I'm slipping. Please." His grip on her leg tightened harder. Emily finally reacted then. "Oh my God." She dropped to one knee instinctively, grabbing the railing beside the ledge for balance while trying to pull herself free at the same time. The man's entire body hung over open air. 30 floors below them, traffic lights moved through the city completely unaware of what was happening above. "How did you get here?" she shouted. The man barely seemed to hear her. "Don't let me fall." His voice cracked with panic. His fingernails scraped violently against the concrete while he tried pulling himself upward. More blood smeared across the rooftop edge. Emily could see his muscles trembling uncontrollably from exhaustion. Then something happened that made her blood run cold. The scene suddenly felt familiar. Not vaguely familiar, exact. The position of the man beneath the ledge, the grip on her ankle, the cold fingers, the breathing, even the wind sounded the same. Emily's mind flashed instantly back to the nightmare. The rooftop, the scraping below the edge, the hands reaching upward. Her heartbeat became painfully fast. No. No, no, no. The realization crashed into her all at once. This was the dream. Not similar to it. The same. Every detail aligned perfectly. The same rooftop edge, the same angle, the same cold grip around her leg. Emily stared down at the man, hanging below her, while terror spread through her body so violently she could barely breathe anymore. The dream had never been symbolic. It had been real. Or worse, it had been waiting. The man looked up at her again with frantic eyes. Then suddenly, his grip slipped. Only for a second. But that second was enough. His body dropped lower beneath the ledge, and his full weight yanked violently against Emily's leg. She screamed as her balance broke instantly. The rooftop tilted beneath her. The city lights spun sideways. For one horrifying moment, Emily saw the exact same image she had seen every night for months. The black drop beneath the building opening below her, and hands pulling her into it. The moment Emily lost her balance, she already knew what was going to happen. Not because she understood the situation, because she had lived this exact second hundreds of times before. Her foot slipped violently across the rooftop gravel as the man's weight pulled downward against her leg. The concrete ledge slammed painfully into her waist for a split second, knocking the air from her lungs. Emily grabbed for the edge instinctively, fingers scraping uselessly across the rough stone while the city tilted sideways around her. Then gravity took her. The world dropped away. Her scream vanished instantly beneath the roar of wind. For one impossible second, Emily remained aware of everything at once. The cold night air, the lights of Chicago spinning around her, the violent pull in her stomach as the rooftop disappeared above. And the man. He was falling with her. Emily saw him twisting through the darkness only a few feet away, his face frozen in absolute terror, while both of them plunged between the buildings. One of his hands still reached upward desperately toward the rooftop they had already left behind. Then the city swallowed them. The sensation felt exactly like the dream. Exactly. That realization struck harder than the fall itself. Every nightmare, every sleepless night, every panic attack. It had never been symbolic, never psychological. The dream had not been her subconscious expressing fear or anxiety or loss of control. It had been this, a memory, or a warning. Wind tore violently past Emily's body, while the building rushed upward beside her in endless black lines of glass and steel. Her hair whipped across her face, hard enough to sting. Tears streamed from her eyes instantly from the pressure of the air. The ground below rose impossibly fast. But something was wrong. The fall felt longer than it should have. Far longer. 30 floors should have ended quickly. Even in panic, even distorted by fear, her body should have already reached the streets below. Yet the city beneath her remained strangely distant, buried under darkness and light that never seemed to grow larger. Emily spun helplessly through the air. Windows flashed past her in distorted reflections. For brief moments, she saw her own terrified face mirrored in black glass. Then other shapes appeared behind those reflections. Figures standing inside dark offices, watching her fall. At first, she thought exhaustion and panic were distorting her vision. But the longer she fell, the more clearly she saw them. Tall silhouettes motionless behind windows that should have been empty at this hour. Some stood too still to be human. Others seemed twisted somehow, their limbs bending at wrong angles beneath flickering office lights. Every single one watched her. The realization filled her with a deeper kind of fear than the fall itself. Emily tried screaming again, but the wind ripped the sound away immediately. Her arms flailed uselessly through open air, while the city stretched endlessly around her. Still falling. Still no ground. The man beside her had stopped screaming. That terrified her most. At some point during the fall, his panic vanished completely. Emily saw him tumbling several yards away now, his body turning slowly through the darkness, while his face stared upward toward the rooftop far above them. Not frightened anymore. Empty, like he finally understood something she didn't. Then he disappeared briefly into shadow between the buildings. Emily's stomach twisted violently as another horrible realization formed. This was not the first time. The thought appeared suddenly and completely. Not the first time she had dreamed this. Not the first time she had fallen. Fragments of impossible memory flashed through her mind in broken pieces while the city blurred around her. Other rooftops, other nights, different buildings beneath different skies. Panic, wind, pale hands pulling downward, always falling, always waking before impact. Except now. She wasn't waking up. The terror that realization created nearly broke her mind completely. No. The word vanished instantly into the rushing air. Emily twisted again mid-fall, trying desperately to orient herself. But direction no longer made sense. The city around her had become wrong somehow. Buildings stretched unnaturally tall now, disappearing endlessly upward into darkness, while the streets below looked farther away than before. The distance between rooftop and ground was growing. That was impossible. Yet she felt it happening. The fall had become endless. The skyline distorted around her in subtle, impossible ways. Windows repeated in patterns that should not exist. Entire buildings leaned at angles that made no architectural sense. Shadows moved between structures faster than gravity should allow. And beneath all of it, the city remained almost completely silent. No horns, no sirens, no screams from witnesses below. Only wind, the same wind from the dream. Emily's thoughts began fragmenting under the panic. Her mind desperately searched for something logical to hold on to, but logic had stopped existing the moment the hand grabbed her ankle on the rooftop. The dream had known. That was the truth she could no longer escape. Every detail had been waiting for this exact moment. The rooftop, the breathing below the ledge, the hands. Even the feeling of losing balance had repeated perfectly. She had not dreamed the future. Something had shown it to her. But why? The question spiraled uselessly through her mind, while she continued falling through darkness and city lights. Another shape moved beside her suddenly. Not the man, something else. Emily caught only a glimpse of it at first. A dark silhouette dropping through the air several stories away, before vanishing between buildings. Then another appeared higher above her. Then another. People, or things shaped vaguely like people. Falling, too. The sight filled her with absolute dread. Some of them moved incorrectly while they dropped. Bodies bending strangely mid-air, limbs twitching against gravity instead of with it. One figure turned slowly toward her while falling upside down, its face hidden completely in shadow despite the city lights around it. Emily's breathing became ragged with panic. The nightmare was larger than her. Far larger. The city itself suddenly felt wrong in a way she could not fully explain. Less like a real place and more like a space built for falling. The buildings existed only as vertical corridors surrounding endless descent. Windows passed by in repeating patterns. Streets below never arrived. Distance stretched infinitely beneath her. Then Emily saw the rooftop again. Far above now. Tiny against the dark sky. For one impossible moment, she saw herself still standing there at the ledge. Another Emily, frozen beside the concrete edge, staring downward. The image vanished instantly, swallowed by darkness and speed, but it remained burned into her mind afterward. The dream was repeating itself, over and over. Not metaphorically, literally. The realization hit with sickening force. Other people had fallen before her, maybe countless others. Maybe every figure she saw in the windows. Maybe the man who grabbed her leg had once stood where she stood now. Another dreamer. Another victim. The city beneath her seemed suddenly alive with hidden movement. Shapes crossing rooftops, pale silhouettes standing at windows, figures watching from impossible distances while she continued plunging downward through endless air. Emily's panic slowly began changing into something else. Not calm, exhaustion. The human mind could not sustain terror forever. Eventually, fear burned itself hollow. Her muscles stopped fighting against the fall because there was nothing left to fight. Her arms drifted weightlessly beside her while cold wind roared around her body. And beneath that exhaustion came a terrible understanding. She had never escaped the dream, not once. Every morning she woke believing the nightmare ended before impact. But what if waking had only been another part of it? The thought horrified her more than anything else. What if the rooftop had always been waiting? What if every sleepless night, every panic attack, every step that led her to Mercer's building had only been moving her toward the moment she was always meant to reach? Emily looked downward again. The street still waited impossibly far below. No closer than before. The city stretched endlessly beneath her like a bottomless abyss of glass, darkness, and distant lights. Still falling, still no ground, and somewhere beside her, in the rushing dark, something else kept falling too. Megan Carter woke up screaming at 3:17 in the morning. The sound tore violently out of her throat before she even understood where she was. She shot upright in bed so fast, the blanket tangled around her legs, nearly sent her falling onto the floor. Her heart hammered painfully against her ribs, while cold sweat covered the back of her neck. For several seconds, she could not breathe properly. The apartment around her remained dark, except for faint city light filtering through the curtains. Somewhere outside, distant traffic moved through downtown Chicago, beneath steady rain. A siren echoed briefly several streets away, before fading into the night. Reality slowly returned, piece by piece. Bedroom, apartment, safe. Megan pressed trembling hands against her face, while trying to steady her breathing. Just a dream. That was what she told herself immediately. Just a nightmare. But even while thinking it, she already knew something felt wrong. The dream remained too clear. Most nightmares dissolved quickly after waking. Details blurred apart within seconds, leaving behind only fragments of fear and disconnected images. This one stayed perfectly intact inside her mind. The rooftop, the city, the wind. Every detail remained sharp enough to touch. Megan glanced toward the digital clock beside her bed. 3:17 a.m. For some reason, the number unsettled her instantly. She rubbed tiredly at her eyes before swinging her legs over the side of the mattress. Sleep had become difficult recently, even before the nightmares started. Long hours at work, too much caffeine, not enough rest. That was probably all this was. Stress. Her therapist would have called it anxiety manifestation or subconscious fear displacement or some other clinical phrase meant to make terror sound manageable. Still, the dream felt wrong. Megan stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen for water. The hardwood floor felt cold beneath her feet, while shadows from the city lights stretched faintly through the apartment. Normally, she enjoyed living alone. The silence helped her think after long days working late downtown. Tonight, the silence felt heavier somehow. She poured herself a glass of water and tried focusing on ordinary things. The hum of the refrigerator, rain against the windows, the distant movement of traffic below. Real sounds, normal sounds. But every few seconds, fragments of the dream returned again. Wind moving across concrete, an empty rooftop beneath a black sky, the feeling of standing too close to a ledge. Megan swallowed hard. She could still remember the exact sensation of the air inside the dream. Cold enough to hurt her lungs when she breathed. The city below had looked enormous and completely dead at the same time. And there had been someone else there. That was the detail she could not stop thinking about. At first, the rooftop had seemed empty. Then she noticed the woman. The image returned suddenly and clearly enough to make Megan freeze in the kitchen. A woman hanging beneath the edge of the roof. Not falling. Hanging. Pale fingers gripping the concrete while her body dangled over the endless drop below. Dark hair whipping violently in the wind. Blood smeared across one hand where her nails had torn against the ledge. And her face. Megan felt genuine nausea twist through her stomach. Because the woman had been staring directly at her. Not screaming, not asking for help. Just staring upward with exhausted, terrified eyes while hanging impossibly far above the streets below. Megan remembered approaching the edge in the dream, despite knowing she shouldn't. The same terrible pull. The same feeling that something waited beneath the rooftop. She remembered trying to stop herself from getting closer while the wind screamed around the building. Then the hanging woman suddenly spoke. Not loudly, barely above a whisper. But Megan remembered the words perfectly. "Don't let me fall." A chill crawled slowly across her skin. The sentence had sounded wrong somehow. Not because of what the woman said, but because of how familiar her voice felt. Megan turned away from the kitchen counter and looked toward the dark living room beyond the apartment hallway. For one horrible second, she thought she saw movement near the windows. a silhouette standing motionless in the dark. Then headlights passed outside, shadows shifted, and the figure disappeared. Nothing there. She exhaled shakily. Lack of sleep. That was all. Still, returning to bed suddenly felt impossible. Megan carried the glass of water into the living room and sat on the couch beneath the faint blue glow of the television. She switched on for background noise. Some late-night news broadcast played quietly, while rain streaked against the windows overlooking the city. Chicago looked normal tonight. Alive. Cars moved through intersections below. Apartment lights glowed in neighboring buildings. Somewhere across the skyline, a helicopter crossed between clouds with blinking red lights. Nothing like the city from the dream. That thought should have comforted her. Instead, it made the nightmare feel even more real somehow. Megan stared down into her untouched glass of water, while exhaustion slowly settled heavier behind her eyes. She should sleep. She had work in 5 hours. The dream would fade by morning like every other nightmare eventually did. But deep down, she already knew it wouldn't. Because even now, sitting awake in her apartment, she could still hear the wind, not outside, in her head, soft and distant, moving through empty rooftops somewhere beyond memory. Megan muted the television. The apartment immediately became too quiet. And in that silence, she thought she heard scraping, faint, metal against concrete, coming from somewhere far below the building. Her pulse quickened instantly. No. She stood and walked carefully toward the living room windows, despite every instinct telling her not to. Rain moved across the glass in thin silver lines, while the city stretched beneath the night sky. Everything looked normal, until she glanced upward. A rooftop stood several floors above her apartment building across the street, barely visible through rain and darkness. And for one impossible second, Megan thought she saw someone standing near the edge, a woman, motionless against the wind. Then lightning flashed somewhere beyond the skyline, illuminating the rooftop for less than a heartbeat. The woman was gone. Megan stepped backward from the window immediately. Her breathing had become shallow again. The dream was still with her, not fading, waiting. Somewhere deep inside her exhausted thoughts, a terrible realization slowly began taking shape. This was not the first nightmare she had ever forgotten. And maybe it would not be the last. Megan looked once more toward the dark rooftop across the street, while rain whispered softly against the glass. Then she finally understood the worst part. The woman hanging beneath the ledge had not looked surprised. She had looked resigned, like she already knew exactly what was about to happen next. And somewhere far above the sleeping city, the wind continued to howl between empty rooftops. Because some nightmares are not created, they are inherited.